Hey y'all, we are back and welcome to Poli-Side-Eye. Jared has not been on my channel in so long. Can you please update the people to just what have you been up to?
Just, minding my business, drinking my water, all the good stuff. But mainly just working on my book. I'm turning my dissertation into a book, so I'm trying to take a look at it and see what I need to do and hopefully get it under contract sometime in the next year or so would be ideal. So that's pretty much taking up most of my time.
And remind us what topic is the dissertation going to be on?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, I'm essentially looking at how or why public education, so really K through 12 education, became a social program or a way to address racial inequality. It wasn't always the case that people looked to education to do that, but there was a specific window in time where that became something that kind of occupied a lot of people's political energy. So I'm trying to do a little bit of exploration and research to try to get to the root of that. And then from there, I'm trying to essentially underscore what I think are some of the consequences of depending on education to address inequalities and why it matters today, especially given all of the politics and battling around education, affirmative action, and all that stuff. So that's it in a nutshell.
Wow. Well, good luck on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the topic today, y'all, I was inspired just by scrolling on Twitter, and I saw the topic had to do with Airbnb and how it's on the verge of collapse. I thought this was interesting because everyone's familiar with Airbnb. I'm sure everyone's stayed in Airbnb. Actually, I tried to look up some Airbnbs for my next trip, and it just doesn't even make sense anymore because it's just as expensive as booking a hotel. Like I remember back in the day, I feel like this was like what, 5 to 8 years ago, that would have been a viable option, just like cheaper. But yeah, I can't remember the last time I even booked the Airbnb.
I don't know the last time I actually booked through Airbnb, like the specific company. I've been on trips where we've had like houses booked, but it's usually been through other vendors or other outlets other than Airbnb. But I guess kind of similar in format, but by and large, I'm hotel me.
It just seems like the hotel is just a little bit more, just more benefits because it seems like there's just so many different charges on Airbnb where you still have to pay them to clean it or whatever, or they're expecting you to clean it. But I digress. So we saw this Twitter post where it said the Airbnb collapse is real. Revenues are down nearly 50% in cities like Phoenix and Austin. Watch out for a wave of forced selling from Airbnb owners later this year in the areas hit hardest by the revenue collapse. So my question is, can you just give a background? Like, why would a crash even be coming or collapse?
I think before we get to the crash, I think it's important to look at Airbnb as a business and what their business model is. So it's pretty, I mean, common sense. So obviously, the way it typically works is most people aren't familiar, I'm sure. But for those who aren't, typically the way it works is someone will essentially make their home available to rent for a short amount of time. So usually Airbnb is usually about for short-term rentals, meaning that it's people who are just need somewhere to stay for like a short trip or a vacation or something like that. Typically, most of Airbnb's business isn't really geared towards long-term rental. So a long-term rental would be, oh, maybe you're in a place for a few months, maybe you're on a work assignment or something. And so you need something a little bit longer than the hotel, but and so you might opt for that. But by and large, most of their business model is premised on short-term rentals. So people will rent out either a portion of their home or the entire home, depending where you are, at a certain rate. When Airbnb first arose, most of the people who participated as hosts rented out the actual home that they lived in. So it wasn't this case that it ended up becoming, which is people bought houses specifically to rent out or specifically to use as an Airbnb property. And so I think it's important to think about that because the way that transformation unfurled has a lot to do with why Airbnb is suffering as a business right now. So why is it that Airbnb is on the verge of collapse? Well, I think it depends where you look. So housing we've kind of talked about this in another episode, but because in the US, not just the US, but the West really, so US, Europe, Australia, Canada, housing in most of those countries is viewed as a commodity first and foremost. So most people, although we obviously need housing to live, I mean to exist, there are a growing number of people who look at housing as an investment vehicle, which has all kinds of problems, especially because in a lot of cities, I mean, you live in New York, housing is always there's always a housing crisis. There's always not enough houses for people, and especially not enough housing that people can actually afford to live in. So that's something that's happening in major cities across the country. But in places like Austin, in Phoenix, or I think, where else was on that list? I don't remember. I think Orlando may have been on the list, Las Vegas. Places like that are what's called Sunbelt cities. And so these are areas that have experienced a ton of population growth over the last couple of decades for a host of reasons that I won't get into for the sake of time. But what ends up happening is that over the last, let's say, decade and a half, housing prices have catapulted in the wake of the 2008, 2009 crisis. So we remember 2008, 2009, there was this huge crash. All of that was because of housing. So in a lot of these markets, what ends up happening is that people swooped into these places, gobbled up a lot of the homes that had been foreclosed from the last crash, and essentially bought those homes for the purpose of turning them into investment vehicles. So what you're seeing really is just another inflating of the same bubble that essentially existed, or that was created in 2007, 2008, 2009. So part of this is to be expected because the type of economy we have is such that bubbles are not only necessary, but there really is no way around it. And so there's always going to be some type of bubble within what's called different asset classes. So property is considered one asset class, stocks and bonds is considered another asset class, so on and so forth. And so right now what we're seeing is just a whole bunch of people who decided to get in while the getting was good, which it was for a little bit. But I argue and others argue that the getting really wasn't that good. It really was an artifact of certain policies pursued by government that made getting into housing at the time a good financial decision, but now the chickens are coming home to roost, essentially. So that's it in a nutshell. And I didn't want to get into too much detail just in case we might have other questions come up, but that's it in a nutshell.
Okay. And I noticed on this list, there's, let's see, Texas, a few cities in Texas, Arizona, Tennessee, Colorado, and Florida.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of this what called Sunbelt cities. So cities that are generally in the South and in the West are the places where you saw Airbnb really explode. And part of the reason that is because housing values in those places really exploded. So because housing values exploded, people decided to jump into that, into the whole property management business in hopes of turning a profit from renting these houses out. So part of the reason that Airbnb was so cheap, let's say, so Airbnb was founded in 2008. So I think that's important because the company emerged kind of in the wake of this crash. So part of the reason it was able to be so affordable when it first started is because after the 2008 crash, the government, really the Federal Reserve, I won't get into too much detail about what that is. And the Cliff Notes version is the Federal Reserve is just the organization or the body that determines how much money is circulating within the economy at any given point. I'm kind of simplifying it, but that's more or less the extent of it. So after 2008, 2009, what the Federal Reserve did was they embarked in this policy of what's called easy money. So essentially they flooded banks with these loans that were essentially interest-free. So banks gobbled up this money and then essentially loaned all of this money out to startups and so on and so forth. And so Airbnb benefited from this policy. And so when Airbnb was loaded up with all of this money, which remember, it's still debt because It's just money that's just being printed, but it has no interest. So what they did was they essentially used this easy money, which is actually the title, the name of the policy, or at least the way that the policy has been described. They took all that money essentially and then embarked on this new endeavor. And so at the beginning, it was really cheap because they can make a huge profit because they had all this easy money to fall back on. But once that easy money dried up, and once interest rates on this credit started to rise again in the last couple of years, or over the last year and a half, really, what you saw is that now it actually costs people, to the owners of Airbnb, I should say, it costs them a lot more to manage this business. And so part of the reason you start seeing prices rise, I was looking at Airbnb recently, and after they tacked on all the fees and stuff, it was so much more expensive to stay at an Airbnb than it was, like you said, at a hotel. But part of the reason it is because the business model could really only be profitable so long as the government was propping up Airbnb, which it effectively was for most of its, at least for the first, let's say 5 or 7 years that it existed. But now that that's done, like the only way that they can make money is to essentially jack up the prices. But they can't really jack up the prices because prices for these houses are starting to fall. So when housing prices fall, you can't really charge as much for the product because the value of the homes that you're renting out is lower. And so now you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, because if you rent out your Airbnb for lower than what you paid for, you're going to lose money. But if you don't rent it out, you're also going to lose money because you're not going to have people paying the rent or paying the fees to stay there. So you're kind of caught in this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And there really is no way out of that. So usually the only way you get out of bubbles is to let it burst. So to people who bought property in the last, let's say, year or two with the aim of renting it out in these places will probably find themselves in a pickle. Because like I said, the only way to get out of a bubble is to burst it. So
wow. Well, you definitely answered my question about like it used to be so cheap, like why is it expensive? I remember in our last episode we were talking about house flipping. So I'm guessing like flipping houses, Airbnb, it just contributes to the problem at hand.
yeah, absolutely. Because housing, it's contradictory. You can't have housing be both an investment vehicle and it be affordable. Like it's not, those two, the math don't math, because part of the way that housing works is that when the value of certain homes in a certain area rise, typically the case is most of the homes in this given area also rise. Well, if you are, let's say, for instance, you live in a neighborhood in, let's use Austin as an example. You live in a neighborhood in Austin making, I don't know, $60,000 a year. If you're trying to, buy a home in that area, you're not going to make enough to do that, because the value of the homes are going to keep going up and up as long as you have people who have the means or the resources to actually buy up these homes and then do whatever they want with it, usually in using them as an investment property. So to buy it, to flip it, or buy it to rent it out, whatever. For people who aren't trying to do that, people who are just trying to find somewhere they can afford to live in, that type of arrangement makes it much harder for them to do that, which is why a number of cities have put restrictions on the number of Airbnb units that can be that can exist at any given time. So like when I lived in North Carolina, Raleigh had an issue for a while where Airbnb, especially downtown, was making it really hard for people to find affordable units. So they put a cap on the number of Airbnbs, or the amount of not just Airbnbs, but the amount of units that could be used for the purposes of speculation, essentially, or using it simply just to make an investment. And so absent those types of restrictions, you end up with situations like Austin, where rent has gone up some astronomical amount over the last couple of years. I think I want to say close to 50%. And meanwhile, people are struggling to afford the rent. And now you don't even have a market anymore, because the economy is, elites won't say it, but the economy is not doing well. Like Biden will give a speech and say that we're not in a recession, the jobs, but all of that is just a dog and pony show. The US economy is actually doing really poorly. Unless you have mechanisms in place through policy, which at least offers some degree of regulation against this type of speculation on housing, you end up with situations where housing just becomes astronomically expensive.
Okay, so knowing all of this, is there a solution? Or what would be your solution if you were in charge and could do something about it?
My solution would be to ban using housing as a means of speculation. When you make housing an investment vehicle, it places a huge burden on people who don't have the wealth to gobble up, all these homes and who are just actually looking for a place to live. And so that's the first thing I'd do. The second thing I'd do is I would surprise tax the rich, because part of the reason cities allow businesses like Airbnb to exist is because they depend on the revenue that comes from property taxes. So when the value of the property goes up, both on homes and as well as like office space, what's called commercial real estate. Typically, that means the city or the municipality gets revenue from the tax that they can levy on those buildings or in those homes. But when the values fall, like obviously, so too do the tax revenues. And so most cities and cities depend very heavily on the tax revenue from commercial real estate, and not only commercial real estate, but also like housing, to fund all types of programs, whether it's in many cities, it's mass transit or just fixing roads or basic shit like running water, like stuff we kind of take for granted. You got to pay for that somehow. Usually it's done through some type of taxation. It's not done through taxation. Cities have to do what's called issuing bonds, which in a nutshell just means that you can rich people, not just rich people, but primarily rich people, loan their money to cities, and then cities have to pay back rich people to use their money to fund stuff that we all need to exist. And so one easy solution to all of this would be to just tax rich people more, and then we wouldn't have to worry about being in this situation where housing just had to increase in value until the end of time, and we could have a steady stream of revenue. But obviously, rich people are going to fight with every ounce of power that they have not to be taxed more. None of us want to be taxed more, but they can do something about it. We usually can't, and so I would do whatever I could to make it so that they were taxed significantly more than they are now, and we can use that taxation to do things like to build housing that people can actually afford to live in, or rather to invest more in the types of policies or regulations that could put caps on these astronomical increases in rents and things like that. So there are solutions to it. It's never a matter of Politics is never a matter of, it's not a technical question. It's always a question of like power and will, like who has the power to do what and who has the will to like commit to whatever vision of the world that they have. And just generally rich people, because they have so much money, they can just pay people to do all of that bidding on their behalf. Whereas we all have to, toil and scrape for what we have. But there are solutions. It's just, again, rich people are going to do everything in their power not to get taxed.
Wow. I mean, the way you answer that question just seems like things are just rigged.
I mean, they are. I mean, but we've talked about this before.
Yeah,
The whole point of capitalism is so a very small sliver of the population can essentially not work, coerce us to work, and appropriate the things that we produce for themselves. Like that's the whole game in a nutshell. And so how do you rectify that? If you're not going to just jettison capitalism as a mode of organization altogether, one way that you could at least make things more equitable is, again, to tax wealthy people more, but they don't want to be taxed more because, again, like they are in this steady desire to accumulate until the end of time, essentially.
So playing as devil's advocate to your 2-point plan, what if someone says, well, Jared, homes being used like as an investment, I can't do that. That's unconstitutional.
No, technically it's not unconstitutional because we have a constitution that sanctifies private property in a way that our constitution. It's also important to remember there's a really good book about this called The Framers' Coup, if anyone's interested. It's all about how the Constitution was written in a way to preserve the rights and the wealth of rich people, essentially. So it's not, the Constitution doesn't exist to offer working people protection. It exists to offer rich people protection. This is well documented. Tons of historians have underscored this. And so part of the issue we face is that even the legal system is not a viable way to remedy many of these injustices, because the legal system is structured to, again, protect the interest of wealthy people, not the interest of people who have to labor for a living. And so one way might be to go about changing the Constitution, but we live in a country where people revere the Constitution, not because they think that the content of the Constitution is meaningful or good, but because we have been socialized from the time we came out of our moms, but you know where, to just idolize the Constitution as though it's this like pie in the sky, like put in a pedestal document. I'm like, no, it's a piece of paper that some rich white men centuries ago decided that they wanted to produce because they knew that anybody with an ounce of common sense would look at this shit and be like, oh, it's a scam. And so what do? Like, oh, they create it and then try to shroud it in this like patriotic language, when indeed what they were most fearful of is the masses of people recognizing that, you know, this is all a scam. And so part of the reason we have patriotism is because patriotism essentially wipes away the type of class consciousness that people have, because then you can't critique these institutions, you can't critique these documents. And so what we need to do is like see through the bullshit that we were socialized to see when we were in elementary school, and we had to stand up and do that dumbass pledge every day, and see what's really at stake, which is this is just a means of letting rich people like essentially get richer.
I felt that. Dropping gems. Anything else on this topic you wanted to highlight to people?
I think people need to understand that what happened in 2008, 2009 is a symptom. It's not a cause of anything. The root cause of all of this is that housing is treated as both a commodity and an asset. And when you treat housing as a financial asset or a financial instrument, what ends up happening is that if you make an investment, what do you expect? You expect your investment to always appreciate in value. Of course, you always hear that, oh, like speculation is inherently risky, and so you could lose, blah, blah. But we have erected an economy in which, because again, wealthy people dictate the policies, they are not willing to take on the risk, which is another reason capitalism is a farce, because the whole idea is that, oh, well, if you speculate, like you could lose, you could gain, but capitalists don't want to lose. Like they have all types of mechanisms, what they call risk management. And even if they do lose money, what happens? The government steps in and bails them out. Like we have a bailout economy. People don't actually like to experience loss. I mean, understandably, but my whole thing is like, you don't want to experience loss, don't speculate. Like it's that easy. But because rich people control the economy, they essentially try to do away with as much risk as possible, and then make us being people who have to work for a living, make us labor extra hard and suffer through the negative consequences, all because they've erected an economy in which they don't want to do anything but appropriate what everybody else has, and essentially leech off of the rest of us by charging these exorbitant rents just so they can have quote unquote passive income, which there's no such thing as passive income. It's always exploitation, because money has to come from somewhere. So if you didn't actually make it or you didn't produce something, where's it going to come from? Somebody else who did, period. So the root of all of that is to stop commodifying housing, stop treating it as an asset, treat it for what it is, which should be a roof over your head so you can come inside when it's raining or snowing or cold or hot or whatever. Period. It's not complicated, people.
Well said. I just have one last question. In New York City, what is the percentage you think of just investment properties and housing that are just sitting there empty?
Good question. Actually, this is a good way of looking at the issue, how ridiculous or psychotic it is. So all of those huge high rises they built up adjacent to Central Park, which they call Billionaires Row, a lot of these crazy skyscrapers, 70, 80, 90, 100 stories, are like vacant, like 70, 80% of them just empty. You know why? Because people buy these properties not with the idea that they should be bought to live in, but as a place to park their money, as an investment vehicle. Meanwhile, New York suffers from some of the most expensive rents in the country, not only the country, in the world. And so you have on one hand, all of these empty buildings And on the other hand, people who cannot afford somewhere to live, in the same city. And so that just goes to show how psychotic it is, because think about if we actually didn't have a situation whereby we had these, these big tall skyscrapers that are just sitting empty because rich people just want somewhere to like hoard their wealth, and actually tax them. If you don't build these big tall buildings, sure, tax them like 80%, and then redirect that money towards, at least providing some form of subsidy or something to people who cannot afford to pay 50 and 60% of their income on housing, which is becoming the case in New York and San Francisco and a number of other major cities. And so I think New York is a good case study for the huge ramifications of treating housing in this way, instead of treating it as a place that, again, you need so that you can escape the elements, essentially. And so we know why all of this is happening. It's just that people don't want to reckon with the fact that we treat housing as an investment instead of what it is, which is a place to escape the elements. And so I'm always imploring people, you don't have to, you don't have to do that. I also have no sympathy for landlords, because people are like, oh, this is my income. You don't have to be a landlord. Literally, you do not have to do it. Nobody has made you, nobody put a gun to your head and said you had to be a landlord. That's a choice. It is a choice you don't have to make. So let's think together about how we can make things better for everybody, as opposed to a handful of people.
If we did a shot game, y'all, of just gems that Jared has thrown out, we would all be on the floor.
I try.
Yeah, the more you fucking know. So with that said, do you have like a book recommendation that goes along with this topic?
Yeah, actually, I do have two. I tried to look at my shelves, but I think they might be in the other room. But I have two, actually. One is called In Defense of Housing, which I think makes a very convincing and compelling argument as to why we have to stop treating housing as a financial asset and as a commodity if we really want to do anything about social inequality, including racial inequality. So I would definitely recommend that one. The other book I would recommend is dealing more with what we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, which is housing bubbles. And so the name of the book is called The Everything Bubble. And it shows how there are certain policies that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury pursue that not only create bubbles, but are created on purpose. And so I think that is a very, very well written, very easy to read book. So I would recommend those two books, In Defense of Housing and The Everything Bubble.
Cool. And I just want to make one point clear, just to see, like, coming from your 2-point plan. So you would abolish like Airbnb type, like the model?
Oh, absolutely. I've always had issues with it since the beginning. But now that it's become so clear, the negative effects of it, i.e. exacerbating housing costs for people who can't afford with their rent already, like, it's abundantly clear to me that something has to be done about that. So absolutely.
And you would abolish house flipping, like just
All of that needs to be done. Yes, housing has, in my view, one function, and that is to provide people a place to go inside when it's raining, snowing, hot, cold, right, whatever. That is the purpose of housing. The purpose of housing is not to make passive income, because as I've already told you, there's no such thing as passive income. All that is a fancy way of saying exploitation.
So you don't like those house flipping shows?
No, I do not. And part of the reason people get into house flipping and all that shit is because we have a whole culture industry that essentially feeds people this nonsense when it's just wreaking havoc on our society. And if you care about racial inequality, you should definitely be against this, because the people who are most affected by this are typically Black people, but not only Black people, but especially in cities like Atlanta and other places in the South where Black people are concentrated, they are affected very directly, very much by this. And so again, if you care at all about racial justice, you definitely should be against Airbnb and house flipping and all that other tomfoolery.
Well then.
Just saying, I'm not judging. I'm just saying.
Right. Well,
what you say, just say.
Send all your inquiries and questions to Jared, and he will answer them.
Just don't come and be crazy.
Speaking of that, where can the people find you? Thank you for enlightening us today.
Obviously I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I don't use either that much, but if you want to find me there, I'm there at JAYC Tiger Fan.
Well, all right. So, y'all, if y'all have any questions or comments or concerns, leave it in the chat. Also, if there's a topic you want us to discuss, let us know. We're always like looking for new things to talk about. With that, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe and share, please. And we will see y'all for the next episode. Bye.